Well, it's time to have our next panel. I'm going to introduce you to our panelists now to talk about vehicle supply. As before, do be putting your questions in. We will try and get to as many of those as we can in the time that we have. First up, we have Greg Archer, UK Director at Transport and Environment. Christoph Domke, Senior Director for Clean and Smart Mobility at FTI Consulting. John Laws, who's the Managing Director at Hitachi Capital Vehicle Solutions. And Ian Constance, Chief Executive at the Advanced Propulsion Centre. Thank you, all of you, to being with us this morning. Greg, I'd like to start with you. Can you talk us a little bit about what the UK is like at the moment as a place to sell electric vehicles? Is it attractive compared to other markets in the world, and what can be done to improve this?
It's not unattractive compared to other markets, but it's certainly true there are bigger incentives in Germany and France than we have in the UK at the present time. But I believe that we can easily tackle that difference and attract more of the electric vehicles which are being manufactured into the UK by simply designing our regulations in a better way to the way that they're designed in Europe. And in particular, by setting slightly higher penalties for vehicle manufacturers for failing to hit their targets for supplying of electric vehicles. And in doing that, it will make it cheaper to miss your target in Europe than miss your target in the UK. And the manufacturers will ensure they supply those vehicles into the UK market.
Well, surely the EU calculates it on number of vehicles sold, and the UK currently calculates it on number of vehicles sold. And whatever the UK does to their rules, the EU is still going to have a higher fine, right, than the UK for a manufacturer missing their targets there.
Not per vehicle, no, Peter. If the fine is higher per vehicle, then for that vehicle sold, it's better to put it into the UK market than the EU market.
Oh yes, that's true. But in total fines, the EU is still likely to be larger. Christoph, can I bring you in on this? Obviously, you look at the global industry and you have experience as an analyst looking at the global sector. How does the UK compare at the moment? And talk a little bit about the current EV supply challenges.
I think there is, I would say, increasing interest from a lot of stakeholders in the industry, from a lot of clients. What is actually the rest of Europe doing? What is the US doing? And particularly when you look at the EV supply, I think we get a lot of questions. What are policymakers looking at in Germany? You heard a little bit about incentive schemes, but it's also about what about building up battery manufacturing? What about building up EV manufacturing? What is actually needed to strengthening local supply chains? And I think there are good examples in Europe, for example, France, Germany, but there is an increasing interest when you speak to people, what is actually the US doing? Because the US is investing quite a lot in terms of supply at the moment. There is a very interesting body out there. There's a lot of interest at the moment in it, called the US DOE ATVM Loans Office Program, which is the loans office program in the US that is offering incentives to a lot of companies to build up EV production, to build up EV component manufacturing. They have done it in the US successfully for all the traditional and non-traditional EV manufacturers, the leading EV manufacturers in this space. So I think this is something that the UK sector can also focus quite a lot in terms of easy access, continued access to loans, and particularly loans for parts and also for EVs. I think it's an important market.
Well, that brings us very nicely to Ian. Ian, tell us a little bit about the work of the APC, and just give us your sense on where the UK is at the moment as a place to build and manufacture electric vehicles.
Yeah, well, Peter, I think we've had some really great successes recently. Nissan have recently announced that they've had, with a bit of support from government, they're going to put their second EV hub in the world. The second after the first one going into Japan is going into Sunderland. Now, they made that decision because making cars in the UK is a highly productive and profitable exercise for them. And this isn't just about bringing a model here. This is about creating an EV hub here and bringing a gigafactory as well. So our first sort of large scale gigafactory into the UK. And the work that we're doing, Peter, is to bring more of that, bring more gigafactories. We're working with a number of potential inward investors at the moment to bring more gigafactories. The fact that in the UK, by 2030, we estimate demand for batteries to be close to 100 gigawatt hours where at the moment we're down at about 5. So massive growth. And of course, you're seeing that growth around the world, but there is a lot of interest to invest in the UK. Now, I think what's really important, though, we need to understand that you can bring the gigafactories, you can bring the car plants and turn them over to EVs, but you've got to look all the way down the supply chain, as Christoph just said. You know, there was real potential for chokes in this system if we don't get the supply of nickel and cobalt and rare earth magnets for motors and things like that, which, whilst the cost of making these things are going to come down, the prices may stay high. That could slow this whole transition down if we don't secure the supplies of those materials.
And we've all seen from the chip crisis recently how something that still costs very little can nevertheless hold up an entire global factory network. I want to come to John briefly before we go back to this topic. John, obviously, you have run recently a very large leasing trial in terms of trying to get supply of electric vehicles into your system. Just give us some insights. What has that taught you in terms of the current state of supply in the market?
Well, I think that the supply in the market is a real big challenge. What I would say that all fleet operators want EVs. They want to embrace electric vehicles into their fleets. They're ready to do it. We're helping lots of fleet providers embracing their decarbonisation strategies, and there's no shortage within the UK businesses to adopt EVs. You know, it's completely transformed in the last 18 months, and all leasing companies are helping their customers. So the biggest problem is the shortage of supply, and we need certainly help from the government, provide incentives. I really like to hear the news about the Nissan factory having UK production will really help that. Let's get the production in the UK and get the UK car and van industry production working really well. So I think, it's going to be a big challenge for all businesses and providers of vehicles in the next 12 to 18 months to really get hold of their vehicles. There's a shortage of supply, and in my business, it's our single biggest challenge.
And obviously, we're going to get electric vans made at Ellesmere Port as well
Yeah,
by Vauxhall at some point in the future. Now, is it, John, in your estimation, is it a question of sort of product selection that there just isn't the product out there in the market anywhere at the moment? Or is it a question of there's product out there, but we need to do more in the UK to try and get that product sent here?
Well, no, I think there is less product, all the things that we all know around semiconductors and just shortage of, the supply chains that Christoph and Ian mentioned are very prevalent in the manufacturing. But, let's make the UK that, if we really want to, we're going first. The 2020 and 2030 ban is just around the corner. It's not that far away. Let's really make the UK the best place to put for the manufacturers for EVs into our market. Best government incentives, and as I said, there's no shortage of need. And I think we're in a great place. Apart from we can't go to the vehicles, so that's a challenge.
Perfect, thank you. We've mentioned chips a couple of times, Christoph. We've been hearing that the chip supply issue is a short-term issue, but we've been hearing that for every quarter for the last 4 quarters, and we're still told it won't be solved till 23. How short-term is the chip supply issue in your estimation?
I think it's a very good question, Pete, and I agree. I'm hearing that back and forth that will end over the summer. I think there was a lot of expectations from companies and from people. We come back from the summer holiday and we see an easing of the crisis. Of course, that hasn't happened. I think it's probably more severe at the moment than it is at any other time before. I think looking forward, I think it's probably something that will stick around for the next 1 or 2 years because there is such a significant demand in the sector for semiconductors. But you shouldn't forget also that car makers or automakers are not the front of the queue. There are a lot of other businesses which have need for much more advanced and more expensive chips, and it's predominantly here the technology and telecommunication sectors. So unfortunately, I have to say, the priority is not the car manufacturers. So I would assume we would see this crisis happening at least until next year or 2023. I think there's a lot of people out there that say 2024, which I doubt, but it will stick around. And it's also not a question of semiconductors all around. If you look to the wider supply chain, I think there is shortages at the moment when you look at plastics, lithium, steels, and other parts. So I think more groundbreaking, there might be time to really look at updating and upgrading of wider supply chains, particularly looking at the sectors that are not fit for purpose. So it's not only limited to semiconductors, but it's probably the most well-known one at the moment.
Yeah, it was a rude awakening for the industry, who's used to going into steel and rubber manufacturers and basically having their way, suddenly to find themselves stuck behind the queue, behind Samsung and Apple and various other people. Greg, can I bring you in on this aspect?
Yeah, because electric vehicles are really benefiting indirectly from the chip shortage. And what we're seeing is manufacturers prioritizing putting the chips they do have into their high margin vehicles. Those high margin vehicles tend to be higher CO2. And as a result, because of the European regulations on CO2, the manufacturers are also needing to increase their supply of electric vehicles in order to ensure that they meet their CO2 targets. So we've seen a really good example of the way that the European CO2 regulations are ensuring and continuing to drive electric vehicles into the European and indeed into the UK markets. And this is ultimately why we've seen the big increase in vehicles over the last couple of years, because of the regulations which have been put in place.
Yeah, exactly. It's actually been interesting that both the pandemic and the chip crisis have forced discipline on some of the car makers in a way that they hadn't had before. Greg, can I just get your thoughts briefly? You talked about the CO2 rules there. I know we touched on this earlier with Caroline from the DFT. Would you support a shift to a ZEV system versus a pure CAFE system that we have at the moment? Do you think that would increase electric car sales here, or would it just make everything more complicated?
No, a ZEV mandate makes things actually a great deal simpler, because the manufacturers are then given a very clear target in terms of the percentage of zero emission vehicles which they need to be selling each year. And that has much wider benefits, because the charge point industry know how many vehicles are going to be coming onto the road. The electricity industry know what the charging needs are going to be for those vehicles. So a ZEV mandate enables the UK economy to plan. It enables the businesses to plan around it, including the manufacturers. And I think what would happen is the UK will become the biggest market in Europe for zero emission vehicles, because we will move faster than the French and the Germans are doing so. And in doing that, we then attract businesses into the UK to build those cars here. And because they will not then have the exchange rate risks and so forth of having to import them into a big UK market. So we can attract the Chinese manufacturers, we can encourage Toyota to invest and Jaguar to invest in building battery electric vehicles here. So this is really a win-win. And on top of that, we think that actually the CO2 savings that come from a ZEV mandate are about 25% higher than a CO2 regulation, because that CO2 regulation won't deliver on the road what it promises from the tests.
We've had a question come in on LCV fleet managers, but while we're on this topic, want to go to Ian on this, on localized production. Ian, are we likely to see in general more localized production of electric vehicles to avoid people having to export and import them across different markets? Obviously, most of the UK manufacturers now are reliant on exports.
Currently we export around 80% of the local production in the UK, and I don't expect that to change hugely, Peter. What I do see though is that there is a growing interest in doing business in the UK. There's some interesting startups and disruptors that are interested in investing and coming to the UK. So for me, it's about growing our overall pool. But the idea that we're suddenly going to go to local manufacture, particularly for volume vehicles, I think is an unrealistic one, because it just wouldn't be efficient to make 400 or 500 different models in the UK at very low volumes. The way you get the costs and the efficiency up is you make high volumes. So I think we will continue to be largely an export market, but I do see the potential to draw in some of these interesting new players in this market.
And how important is it, in order to get those players, to have, as you've said, production facilities or capabilities further down the supply chain, in terms of not just the gigafactories, but everything else that feeds into?
Well, that's really important. I think what we've been saying to government is that there's four fundamental elements. First of all, we've got to recognise that to get people to invest here, there's got to be some incentives because that's a global competition to attract people. But you've also got to be able to, do planning quickly in an organized and sort of consistent way. You've got to be able to provide low cost electricity, which is green, and all of those kind of things, because you don't want loads of embedded carbon. So that's part one. Part two is build the supply chain at scale. That's batteries, motors, power electronics, hydrogen systems. Number three is we've got to continue to innovate because the costs have to come down. The utility of these vehicles has to go up to get everybody in this market, not these early adopters and sort of the people that can afford to have company cars and all that kind of thing. We've got to get everybody in them. And then the fourth thing is we've got to look to net zero. So that's our kind of mantra about attracting people here and building the whole system.
Perfect. Thank you. We've had a lot of questions come in. A question here for John specifically. Talk a little bit about what resources are available to LCV fleet managers to help them integrate, electric variables into fleet planning, what expertise is needed, financing, all sorts of issues. Just talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, so firstly, what we'd be recommending fleet managers is firstly do an audit of their requirements, do an audit of their depots. So for instance, we're helping in our organisations fully electrify their depots so they can charge vehicles at the right time. They know which vehicles are going out, first. So it's all about sort of logistics planning. So we're no longer just supplying the vehicles and maintaining the vehicles. Our business is sort of creeping into the whole lot of logistics planning of how to adopt electric vehicles. And that you can't just order 20 electric vans to run out of a certain depot. You need to make sure the the supply of electricity and green electricity, renewable energy is available to you. So if you really want to be a carbon zero organization, it goes right the way through, right back to supply chain of electricity. And so we're helping organizations do this today. So I would just encourage fleet operators to really think completely differently and look at the whole supply chain around how do they embrace electric vehicles within their operations, especially vans. Cars works very much with home charging. If people, 50% of people can park on the driveways, and I think that's working well. We've seen investments with public charging, and that public charging is still the single biggest barrier to mass adoption of EV cars in the UK. But with commercial vehicles, the biggest barrier is really adopting it within their depot infrastructure, and that organizations can help fleet provider and fleet organizations achieve that.
But what if a business manager who needs a fleet of vans says, actually electric vans at the moment just don't meet my needs? I might get an order that needs me to drive 300 miles, and if I've only got an electric van available, well, then I lose that business. I mean, they say that some of the products at the moment just isn't right for them.
Well, that's probably true, but in some respects, that's, if I'm being sort of a bit frank, that's an excuse not to do electric vehicles full stop. That might be 1 or 2 in 10 occasions, where there's probably 8 occasions where they can adopt electric vehicles. So I don't think there's one size fits all. You have to look at the whole fleet strategy, your whole operations. And I can guarantee you that all the organizations that we're speaking to, and 85% of my customers who run LCVs have electric vehicles in their fleet today. Okay, and I say, so it can be done. So maybe not completely en masse right here, right now, for every single operation, but for sure, they can adopt EVs to some degree today. And why would you want to wait? You're just going to get behind your competitors, and it's just madness to wait.
It's interesting when Ford's been marketing the F-150 Lightning, which is obviously an electric pickup truck. They've said, they've marketed it specifically to business owners, specifically on running costs, which is, interesting. They're trying to say it's actually a cost advantage to have one of these.
I totally agree with that, Peter. There's our TCO models are saying electric vehicles are at parity with police vehicles. That's an excuse not to adopt EVs.
Exactly. Thank you. We are almost out of time. I'm going to come to Greg for final thought on vans, and then we're going to wrap.
Yeah, the reason there's no supply of vans is because the EU targets for vans are way weaker than the EU targets for cars. It's because the EU got their sums wrong back in 2008 when they set the targets. The simple solution is let's set an ambitious ZEV mandate target for vans. The industry will then have to start supplying a lot more vans, and they'll supply the vans which people need, which they're not doing at the moment. So this is a problem which can be solved through regulation very easily.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm not going to get myself into trouble by commenting on the EU's maths. I'll leave that to others. But thank you, Greg, Christoph, Ian, John. Thank you very much for your thoughts there. Thank you to you for your questions